Tonight, we drift across warm equatorial waters past coral reefs glowing pale beneath the moonlight to a chain of lush volcanic islands where the air is heavy with nutmeg, clove, and cinnamon scents that once lured half the world into obsession. The sails of strange wooden ships creak overhead, their crews driven by dreams of spice fortunes and power. The sea glitters, the forests pulse with life, and deep within the emerald canopy voices chant in languages older than maps. This is the beginning of a long and tangled story, one of trade, conquest, resistance, and finally, independence. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world like a family, scattered but still connected. All right, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. You trudge barefoot through the damp soil of the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands. It's the late 1500s and you're among nutmeg trees whose round fruit crack open to reveal crimson threaded seeds that smell almost divine. These tiny parcels of fragrance might look innocent, but they're about to shake the world. Far away, Europeans are boiling their meat with these spices to cover the taste of decay, and they'll pay absurd sums to do so. So naturally, someone gets the bright idea to sail thousands of miles to find the source and take control. Cue the Portuguese first, then the Spanish, but soon it's the Dutch who arrive in earnest, hardened merchants with well-armed ships and a singular obsession with monopolizing the spice trade. At first, the Dutch play nice, they trade flatter and smile. But alliances are slippery in these parts, and when the sultanates of Ternate and Tidore sense danger, tensions begin to sizzle. You watch as deals curdle into skirmishes. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, forms in 1602, one part merchant guild, one part private army, and entirely ruthless. Historians still argue whether the VOC was a company or a colonial power in disguise. Maybe both. They build forts, blockade rival ports, and when local resistance rises, they answer with cannonballs. One of the grimmer moments comes when the Banda Islands refuse to sell nutmeg, only to the Dutch. In 1621, VOC Governor Jan Pieterszoon Cohen responds by ordering a massacre. You hear the silence after a silence filled with loss, and the sound of new slaves being brought in to work the land. Still, not everything goes according to VOC plans. Disease rips through their settlements, and internal corruption drains their coffers. The seas are long and pirates longer. Even the spices themselves, once rare, begin to feel less exotic as plantations rise in Ceylon and the Caribbean. But here in the archipelago, the Dutch keep expanding slowly, painfully into Java, Sumatra, and beyond. They don't control everything, not yet. Local kingdoms still thrive. The Sultan of Mataram eyes the VOC with suspicion, while in Aceh a queen rules with steel and diplomacy. You can almost smell the court incense and hear the rustle of silk as envoys negotiate rebel and retreat. And yet while all this unfolds, life continues in the villages. You see mothers grinding cloves into healing pastes, fathers teaching sons to read Arabic, and children diving into sapphire waters after pearls. Colonialism feels distant at times until taxes rise or soldiers march past. There's a quirky little fact you overhear on one of the docks. Nutmeg, once believed in Europe to cure the plague, actually has mild hallucinogenic properties. Some traders begin chewing it like candy. Bad idea. The hallucinations make the long sea voyage interesting, to say the least. The VOC limps into the 1700s, increasingly bloated, corrupt, and fragile. But don't get too excited, it won't collapse for another century. And when it does, the Dutch crown steps in like a strict parent cleaning up after a wild party. But that's for later. For now, you lie under a star-pinned sky in the Moluccas, the scent of clove drifting on the breeze, knowing the world is changing, and not entirely in a way the islands asked for. Now the scent of spice gives way to something different. Coffee beans roasting in the morning sun, mingling with the brackish sting of canal water. You arrive in Batavia, the beating colonial heart of the Dutch East Indies, where the VOC has planted its flag and ambitions squarely on the northern coast of Java. Built on the ruins of the Javanese port of Jayakarta, Batavia is a strange marriage of European vision and tropical reality. The Dutch try to replicate Amsterdam here, narrow canals, brick buildings, straight lines and street grids, but the swampy earth pushes back. Mosquitoes breed like mad scientists in those canals, and the air hangs heavy with disease rot and something else ambition. You walk the cobbled streets in sandals that squish with dampness, passing a bakery selling cinnamon rolls because, of course, while enslaved labourers hauled teak wood to build yet another gabled house for yet another Dutch merchant who thinks he can outwit malaria. Historians still debate whether Batavia was a viable city or a colonial fever dream. You hear a story about a colonial governor who claimed Batavia was cleaner than Amsterdam while literally sweating through a fever. Maybe he believed it, but it's hard to say. But underneath the architectural pride, coercion simmers. The VOC controls land labour and trade. Indigenous people are taxed, displaced, or outright enslaved. Whole villages are uprooted to build roads or plantations. The city is ringed by fortresses and guarded with cannons, but no wall can keep out resentment. You notice it in glances that linger too long, in the way market women fall silent when a European soldier walks past. It isn't loud yet, but the rebellion is fermenting slowly like the coffee beans the Dutch export in bulk to Europe. You meet Chinese merchants here too, part of a bustling, complicated economy. But in 1740 things turn dark. Fearing an uprising, the Dutch unleash a horrific pogrom against the Chinese community. Thousands are killed, the canals run red. You don't need to hear the cries to feel the echo. Afterward, the Dutch try to explain it as a preemptive strike. Others call it a massacre. Either way, Batavia becomes more tightly controlled, more paranoid, less alive. Still, Batavia hums. Ships come and go. Bureaucrats write reports about nutmeg quotas and rice yields. Dutch wives swat flies with delicate fans, while Javanese nannies cradle their children. And far inland on Java's volcanic spine, local rulers plot. The Sultan of Mataram Agung, later Pakubuwono, refuses to be a puppet. Wars erupt. The Dutch send soldiers, lose them, and then send more. The cycle is vicious. You sit with a group of Javanese elders one evening as they whisper stories of resistant spirits and destiny. They say the land remembers everything. There's a quirky belief that Batavia is cursed, not just metaphorically but spiritually. Locals speak of ley lines, restless ghosts, and sacred graves that were disturbed when the city was built. One colonial officer even blames his misfortunes on a haunted banyan tree. You pass it wide-trunked and mossy and feel a chill that has nothing to do with the sea breeze. The VOC starts to fall apart in the late 1700s. Corruption bleeds it dry. Executives fight more with each other than with rebels. Napoleon takes over the Netherlands back in Europe, and French interference only adds to the chaos. In 1799, the Dutch government finally dissolves the VOC. It's over. But surprise, it's not the end of colonial rule. The Dutch crown steps in and nationalizes the entire operation. Now Batavia isn't just a company town, it's an imperial capital. And so the city endures weirdly stable and wildly unequal. Dutch elites sip gin in shaded courtyards, while Javanese workers collapse from sunstroke in the fields. The colonial dream has mutated. Now it isn't just about trade, it's about control, extraction, identity. You leave Batavia with a strange feeling in your chest, part fascination, part nausea. The streets seem calm, but only because dissent has learned to hold its breath, for now. You find yourself sliding through the teak-shadowed halls of a Javanese kraton, where delicate silk fans stir air, heavy with incense and whispered secrets. The royal courts here, led by sultans like Agung of Mataram, are centers not just of power, but of culture, mysticism, and subtle defiance. It's a world where tradition blends with quiet resistance, where poets and scholars compose verses that hide political messages beneath layers of metaphor, and where Islam interweaves with ancestral beliefs in ways that outsiders often misunderstand. The Sultan wields influence far beyond palace walls. He's a master of ceremonies, a custodian of Javanese identity, and a thorn in the side of Dutch ambition. You overhear courtiers speak in hushed tones about strategies to push back the VOC's encroachments, not with open warfare, but through diplomacy, alliances, and spiritual authority. Sultan Agung famously resisted the Dutch in the early 1600s, rallying forces in prolonged campaigns against Batavia, yet historians still argue whether his failure to capture the city was due to military overreach or internal court politics. Maybe it was a bit of both. Meanwhile, Islamic mystics Qiyai quietly nourish a different kind of rebellion. They teach communities not just to pray but to preserve autonomy, to read the Quran in ways that inspire social justice and defiance against foreign rule. Pesantren, traditional Islamic boarding schools, become unexpected hubs of knowledge and quiet activism. You imagine young students learning Arabic calligraphy by day and hearing stories of heroes who dared to challenge the colonial yoke by night. Local rulers across the archipelago mirror this pattern. In Aceh, a fierce queen leads resistance for decades. In Banten, sultans negotiate with Dutch officials while fortifying their own territories. The interplay of collaboration and confrontation is complex, a dance with no clear winner yet. And, beneath all this, common people find subtle ways to resist secret meetings, folklore that encodes hope, even using crocodile dung as sunscreen to mock Dutch soldiers' fancy lotions, a quirky detail that reminds you how culture resists in unexpected forms. The royal courts are also centers of art, music, and philosophy, maintaining Javanese traditions despite the growing shadow of colonialism. You hear gamelan orchestras playing haunting melodies that seem to carry messages of endurance. Historians still debate how much these cultural expressions were acts of resistance versus adaptations to survive under Dutch pressure. Perhaps they were both a way to keep the soul intact when the body is constrained. In this mix of power, spirituality, and subtle defiance, you see the first seeds of Indonesian identity, complicated, layered, and resilient. The court's whispered plots and mystical teachings may seem distant from the violence of colonialism's surface, but they form the deep currents shaping what would become a nation's heart. And as the sun sets behind volcanic peaks, you sense that while the Dutch rule outwardly, the spirit of resistance simmers quietly beneath. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of drying leaves and the faint sweetness of sugarcane as you walk through the terraced fields where the Dutch cultivation system takes root. It's the 19th century now, and the VOC is long gone, replaced by the more direct grip of the Dutch crown. But their ambitions haven't changed. They want to squeeze wealth from the archipelago, this time through a system so meticulously crafted it's sometimes called forced agriculture, with a polite European veneer. You watch local farmers, once growing their own rice and tending diverse crops, now ordered to devote a portion of their land and labor to cash crops like sugar, coffee, and indigo. These goods don't nourish local bellies. Instead, they're packed into ships bound for Europe's bustling markets. The government calls this the cultivation system, or cultuurstelsel, and officially it's supposed to boost the colony's economy while benefiting the people. But you see the cracks immediately. Fields fall, fallow food shortages rise, and villages strain under new taxes and demands. It's hard to miss the irony. The rice bowls of Java empty as farmers focus on crops that can't feed their own families. Malnutrition creeps in quietly alongside profits, and villages watch helplessly as Dutch coffers fill. You overhear a sarcastic joke among a group of farmers. The Dutch want our sweat, but they leave our stomachs dry. Quirky as it sounds, there are stories of farmers attempting to cheat the system by growing crops in secret, or even staging mock illnesses to avoid labor drafts. Resistance here wears many faces, some disguised as passivity, others more boldly defiant. Historians still argue whether the cultivation system accelerated Indonesia's modernization or simply deepened colonial exploitation. Some claim it laid the groundwork for infrastructure like roads and railways, while others say it destroyed traditional agrarian life. You wander dusty roads connecting coffee plantations, passing laborers whose backs are bent not just from toil, but from the weight of an unjust order. You catch wind of a curious detail. The Dutch even forced some farmers to plant indigo, a crop so caustic It poisoned the soil for years, making the land infertile after harvest. It's a bizarre example of colonial short-sightedness that seems to scream, profit first, consequences later. You think about how this legacy would haunt the land and its people for generations. Beyond the fields, the cultivation system also reshaped social dynamics. Wealthy Javanese landlords sometimes cooperated with the Dutch growing rich, while peasants suffered a tension that fueled later nationalist sentiments. Meanwhile, colonial officials tightened control, creating a bureaucracy focused more on extraction than welfare. You see how a system that claimed to be civilizing actually tightened chains rather than loosening them. But not all was lost. Within these fields and villages, stories circulate of hope, of people banding together, sharing scarce resources and keeping traditions alive despite hardship. The cultivation system may have forced labor and crops, but it couldn't fully harvest the spirit of resistance that simmered beneath the surface. Amid the shadows of colonial control, you find unexpected flickers of light, hidden schools, peasantry, and informal classrooms where knowledge becomes a quiet rebellion. The 19th and early 20th centuries bring new ideas and new hopes, even as the Dutch tighten their grip. The colonial government introduces schools to train native bureaucrats and clerks, hoping to create obedient functionaries, but something else begins to take root. Education becomes a seedbed for thought, aspiration, and increasingly nationalist sentiment. You imagine young students sitting cross-legged under fans learning Dutch history and literature, but also reading about freedom and justice from imported books. Some attend mission schools, others stick to Islamic boarding schools, where religious teachings intertwine with lessons on community and resistance. The peasantry are more than just places of worship. They're hubs where critical thinking blooms, where young minds question the world and their place in it. You hear a quirky rumor that some students sneaked banned nationalist pamphlets hidden inside their Quran, an act of subtle rebellion that could get you expelled or worse. Historians still debate how much these educational institutions truly empowered Indonesians versus serving colonial interests. Did Dutch schools create loyal subjects, or did they inadvertently cultivate the leaders of independence? Maybe it was both, depending on which classroom you peeked into. You picture a group of spirited youths in Batavia debating late into the night, inspired by global ideas of democracy and self-rule filtering in from the wider world. Figures like Kartini emerge, a Javanese noblewoman whose letters champion women's education and emancipation, challenging both colonial and traditional restrictions. Her legacy becomes a beacon for reformers and radicals alike. Meanwhile, newspapers and journals begin circulating in native languages, spreading news and stirring political consciousness. You can almost feel the pulse of awakening as local intellectuals read speeches by Gandhi, Marx, and others, adapting these ideas to the archipelago's unique struggles. It's a slow but steady flame. On a lighter note, colonial schools sometimes hosted awkward cultural events, where Indonesian students performed traditional dances in stiff European costumes, causing amusement and cultural confusion alike. These performances, while intended to showcase native culture, sometimes became moments of reclaiming identity in the face of imposed norms. You sense the formation of a new social class, the educated priai, who would soon form the backbone of nationalist movements. Their journey is fraught with contradictions caught between colonial structures and the yearning for freedom. As you listen to their stories, you realize that education, once a tool of control, is turning into a quiet revolution. The horizon darkens not just with tropical storms, but with the distant thunder of war as the Japanese Empire marches into the archipelago in 1942, pushing out the Dutch and rewriting the rules of power. The Japanese occupation shocks everyone. It's a swift, ruthless replacement of one colonial master with another wrapped in the slogan, Asia for Asians, which feels more like a bitter joke whispered in the shadows than a genuine promise. You walk through bombed-out towns and makeshift barracks where soldiers in khaki uniforms patrol dusty streets. The Dutch, who once seemed invincible, vanish or retreat into internment camps. For many Indonesians, this is a moment of hope and fear tangled together. The Japanese restrict freedoms, impose harsh labor demands, and dismantle much of the colonial bureaucracy, but they also encourage to some extent nationalist organizations hoping to harness local energy for their own war aims. Historians still argue whether the Japanese occupation accelerated Indonesia's path to independence or merely delayed it under harsher terms. It's a question tangled in suffering and strategy. You overhear stories of forced laborers Romusha sent to build railways and military facilities, often never to return. The human cost is staggering, yet beneath the hardship, nationalist leaders like Sukarno and Hatta emerge from the shadows, gaining prominence with cautious Japanese support. Sukarno, once imprisoned by the Dutch, now tours the islands delivering fiery speeches about unity and independence, though always under the watchful eyes of the occupying forces. Schools and newspapers shift tone. Indonesian language flourishes while Dutch is banned. People learn that their own tongue, once suppressed, can be a tool of awakening. Yet everyday life is precarious. Food shortages and repression are rampant. You spot a curious detail. Japanese soldiers were fascinated by batik and sometimes wore traditional clothes during cultural events, blending a strange mixture of respect and domination. Despite the occupation's brutality, the Japanese inadvertently ignite a stronger sense of national identity. Local militias trained by Japanese forces later become the backbone of revolutionary fighters. But the promises of liberation feel hollow. The people know too well that new masters can be just as cruel. You watch Sukarno's careful balancing act, charismatic yet pragmatic, willing to collaborate enough to gain leverage, but never fully trusting the occupiers. The atmosphere is tense, charged with anticipation and anxiety. The war rages globally and the archipelago is a powder keg. As the Japanese surrender looms in 1945, the stage is set for something unprecedented. Independence is no longer a dream whispered in secret. It's a fire ready to ignite. But how to seize that moment without being crushed by the returning Dutch? The answer, as you will see, lies in courage, cunning, and chaos. The dawn breaks on August 17, 1945, crisp and alive with possibility, as you find yourself in Jakarta's humble house, where Sukarno and Mohammad Hatta prepare to proclaim what had long seemed impossible, Indonesia's independence. The world is still reeling from the devastation of World War II, and the Japanese surrender leaves a chaotic power vacuum in the archipelago. Amid the uncertainty, these two leaders step forward, voices steady despite the storm gathering beyond their walls, declaring a new nation's birth with words that will echo for generations. The proclamation is swift and simple, yet monumental. Newspapers print the fiery announcement, radios crackle with the news, streets fill with cautious celebration. But the air is thick with tension. The Dutch, humiliated but unyielding, are preparing their return. Allied forces tasked with disarming the Japanese inadvertently become entangled in this new conflict. Historians still argue whether Sukarno and Hatta's decision to declare independence at that exact moment was a brilliant strategic gamble or an impulsive leap into the unknown. Either way, it was a turning point. You witness the uneasy calm as Dutch troops backed by British and Australian forces begin to reassert control, aiming to re-establish colonial rule. Cities become battlegrounds where Indonesian youths Pemuda arm themselves with whatever they can find: bamboo spears, hunting rifles, sheer willpower. Battles erupt in alleys and rice fields. The revolution is raw, messy, and deeply personal. Amidst this, Sukarno's charisma is both a unifying force and a source of controversy. He walks a tightrope between diplomacy and defiance, negotiating with foreign powers while inspiring fighters with impassioned speeches. The rivalry between diplomatic efforts and armed resistance creates a complex tapestry of conflict. You overhear a quirky anecdote from these days. To boost morale, Indonesian fighters sometimes painted their faces with traditional war motifs, blending ancient symbolism with modern guns, a vivid reminder that the revolution was as much cultural as it was political. The international community watches cautiously. The United Nations forms in the aftermath of the war, but Indonesia's struggle for recognition is fraught. Western powers, wary of communist influence and geopolitical shifts, hesitate to fully endorse the fledgling republic. Meanwhile, Indonesian leaders navigate a labyrinth of negotiations, ceasefires, and occasional betrayals. As you walk through the bustling markets and damaged neighborhoods, you sense a country in flux, hope tangled with fear, victory shadowed by sacrifice. The battle for independence is far from over, and every step forward feels like a negotiation between dreams and reality. You find yourself deep in the humid jungles and dense rainforests where guerrilla fighters, known as the Tentara Republik Indonesia (TRI), move like shadows, slipping between the trees with a mix of grit and grace. The revolution is no longer fought just in cities or courts, but in the tangled undergrowth where small bands of poorly armed fighters face off against better-equipped Dutch troops. The jungle becomes a battlefield, a refuge, and a symbol of the Indonesian spirit, unyielding and elusive. These fighters blend traditional weapons with stolen rifles, their tactics shaped by knowledge of the terrain and a fierce commitment to independence. Villagers secretly supply them with food and intelligence, risking brutal reprisals. It's a deadly game of cat and mouse, and the forest seems to hold its breath. You imagine the heavy air, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of gunfire echoing beneath the canopy. It's a world far removed from the Dutch boardrooms and diplomatic negotiations, but just as crucial. Meanwhile, in faraway The Hague and on international stages, politicians argue and negotiate over Indonesia's fate. The United Nations becomes a key arena with Indonesian representatives making impassioned pleas for recognition, while Dutch diplomats try to maintain their grip. You drift between these two worlds, the raw, perilous fight on the ground and the sterile, complex diplomacy above, both entwined in the same struggle. You overhear a whispered debate among scholars: did the guerrilla warfare prolong the conflict, or was it essential in pressuring the Dutch into eventual withdrawal? Perhaps it was both. The revolution's messy reality defies simple explanations. Amid the dense forests, you notice an unusual alliance. Former Japanese soldiers, now prisoners or deserters, sometimes assist Indonesian fighters, offering training or weapons. It's a paradox born of war's chaos. Enemies turned reluctant comrades against a common foe. Back in villages, stories of heroism circulate, of women smuggling ammunition, of elders negotiating peace, while children play amidst the ruins. The war is not just men with guns, it's entire communities woven together by resilience. Yet the toll is high. Homes burn, families are torn apart, and hunger stalks the land. You feel the exhaustion that seeps into bones and hearts, but also the stubborn hope that fuels every whispered promise of freedom. You float from the misty rainforests of guerrilla warfare into the cool, echoing chambers of international diplomacy, where Indonesia's fate hangs on tense negotiations and global politics. Bombed-out cities in the archipelago bear the scars of conflict, but here in neutral rooms, far from the battlefields, diplomats in suits argue over words, borders, and recognition with the same intensity as soldiers on the ground. The United Nations, newly formed after World War II, becomes a crucial battleground, not for guns, but for votes and rhetoric. Indonesian representatives, tireless and impassioned, lobby tirelessly for sovereignty, while the Dutch wield influence among Western powers, arguing that Indonesia's independence threatens stability and economic interests. It's a high-stakes chess game where every move counts. You witness scenes of ambassadors pacing, whispering urgent messages and drafting resolutions. It's bureaucratic and bewildering, yet undeniably vital. The international community is divided, with some countries supporting Indonesia's right to self-determination, while others prioritize Cold War alliances and colonial loyalties. Historians still debate how much global geopolitics delayed Indonesia's recognition, and whether Indonesia's leaders skillfully navigated or stumbled through this maze. Amidst this heavy political atmosphere, you catch a light-hearted story. During one UN session, an Indonesian delegate humorously compared colonialism to an unwanted house guest who refuses to leave, drawing quiet chuckles even in stiff halls. Humor becomes a subtle weapon, a way to humanize and soften the hardened faces of diplomacy. On the ground, the conflict intensifies, with Dutch forces launching police actions to retake territory, while Indonesian fighters respond with increasing desperation and determination. The war's brutal ebb and flow contrasts sharply with the calm formality of the UN halls, finally mounting international pressure, including from the United States and newly independent India, forces the Dutch to reconsider. After prolonged talks, ceasefires, and some humiliating setbacks, the Netherlands agrees to transfer sovereignty in December 1949, an official end to colonial rule, but the beginning of Indonesia's challenging journey as a nation. As you stand among the cheering crowds raising the red and white flag, you sense that the battle for recognition was as crucial as any battlefield victory, a testament to the complex dance of guns and words that shaped modern Indonesia. The red and white flag rises over a country reborn, fluttering proudly against a sky still heavy with the scars of struggle. Independence has been won, yet the echoes of colonial rule linger like shadows at dusk deep in the economy, woven through politics and whispered in countless stories passed down through generations. You wander through Jakarta's bustling streets where new institutions form amid the ruins, and faces carry the hopeful exhaustion of a people emerging from decades of foreign domination. The scars are real infrastructure battered by war, economic systems still tethered to Dutch-era trade patterns, and social divisions sharpened by years of occupation and conflict. Leaders like Sukarno wrestle with the enormous task of uniting an archipelago of thousands of islands, languages, and cultures into a single nation. The balance between tradition and modernity, unity and diversity, freedom and stability, feels like walking a tightrope over a restless sea. You overhear stories from elders who lived through colonial times, some bitter, some nostalgic, all tinged with complexity. The legacy of forced labor education policies and cultural suppression shapes their memories, but so does resilience and hope. The young generation looks forward with eagerness but carries the weight of history in their eyes. A quirky fact lightens the mood: the Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya, was once banned by the Dutch, but it became an underground hymn of resistance, sung softly in hidden corners and schoolyards, a musical thread stitching the nation's soul. Historians continue to debate how colonialism's imprint influences Indonesia's post-independence path. Was the Dutch rule a necessary evil that laid groundwork for modernization, or a brutal interruption that delayed true development? Perhaps, like most history, it's a tangled mix of both. As night falls and you settle into the gentle rhythm of a new Indonesia, you feel the weight of countless voices of warriors, scholars, mothers, and children who stitched together freedom from spice-scented dreams, bloodied jungles, and whispered prayers. Their story is not just one of conquest or defeat, but of endurance, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of self-determination. The flag waves on, the wounds remain, but so does hope. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world softens into shadows, imagine the vast archipelago settling into a quiet stillness, the distant hum of the ocean blending with the rustle of palm leaves swaying gently in the tropical breeze. The story you've traveled through, from spice-scented islands to jungle guerrilla battles, from royal courts to crowded diplomatic rooms, fades now into a calm whisper, like the soft closing of an ancient book. Remember the scent of cloves carried on humid air, the crackle of radio voices proclaiming a nation's birth, and the resolute faces of those who dared to dream freedom. History is never neat, but in this quiet moment it becomes a gentle tide, washing over the shores of memory, softening sharp edges, soothing wounds, and nurturing the tender shoots of hope. The struggles and scars remain true and undeniable, but so does the enduring spirit of a people who, against staggering odds, wove unity from diversity and courage from hardship. Let that thought settle like a warm blanket, comforting and sure as you drift toward sleep. Feel the peaceful rhythm of night wrapping around you, the steady pulse of life continuing quietly but persistently, just like the story you carry with you now. There's a gentle strength in endings like these, soft, steady, and full of promise for a new dawn. Rest easy, knowing that even the longest journeys find their rest, and the whispers of history will carry you safely through the night.